Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about The Secret of NIMH from 1982. And this is the winner of my Patreon movie review vote. If you would like for me to review a movie of your choice, then click on the link below and pledge, and maybe I'll be reviewing your movie next month. The Secret of NIMH is a pretty historic movie in the history of animation, as it is Don Bluth's first feature, and that can't really be understated because it really was a big deal. And in the 1980s there weren't a lot of animated films being made to this level. There were other animated films, but there weren't really new studios being announced. There were a lot of attempts, or a lot of adult animated films in the 70s and early 80s and so forth, but this was sort of a different thing. It was more kid skewing than a lot of that stuff. It was much more detailed, trying to recall the time, the classic era of Disney animation, the first 5 features like Snow White and Pinocchio and Fantasia. Don Bluth did that by cutting corners, but also demanding perfection in terms of the animation process, with half the amount of money and half the amount of time to do so. And it's frankly amazing this film came out as well as it did. And there's a lot going on in it. There's a lot of characters, there's a lot of things happening within it, almost too many things. But in a lot of ways that sort of works for it because of what it has going through the entire film, and that's Mrs. Brisby. Now, Mrs. Brisby is basically trying to find a cure for her son Timmy, who has pneumonia and is very sick, and she also needs to move because the plow is going to come through and basically destroy everything. Although they're in a cement block, so maybe that wouldn't have happened, but oh yeah, I didn't think of that way. Would that crush a cement block? I feel like maybe. Anyway, so she has to move, but she can't really move Timmy because he needs bed rest because he has pneumonia, and she goes on a journey to kind of find a way to kind of move her house or move Timmy successfully while keeping him alive so he can rest up and be better. That's basically what the film really is about. And because you have this kind of through line through Mrs. Brisby, you are able to kind of navigate through this film that has a ton of world building, a lot going on. You can just see these little snippets of this larger world. The fact that she goes into kind of a rat kingdom where these intelligent rats who are genetically experimented on have learned how to use electricity and have started to like basically evolve and be almost as smart as humans, or pretty close or smarter, and start to understand that they need to kind of make their own way rather than stealing from humans, even though they're stealing electricity from the farmhouse. This all takes place on a farm, by the way. They're using that power to like make this whole society, and like that could really be its own movie, to be honest. You don't really need Mrs. Brisby, but because you have her there, they can kind of skirt around like getting into the full details of things. Now, I know this is based on a book called Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. It couldn't be called Mrs. Frisby because of Frisbee, like the disc that you throw around and your dog catches if you have a dog and stuff, was threatening to sue them unless they changed the name, so they had to change it to Brisby, and apparently didn't change it. Like, all the voices had been recorded, so they actually had to have the sound editor made the Brisbys in this, which, by the way, amazing sound editing because it's never noticeable when you're watching it. Even though I knew that before going in, I was like, it's like, sounds like Brisby to me. I like didn't even question it, and then I remembered that fact afterwards. I was like, oh, I'm sure there's a larger world that they go into. I've never read the book, nor have I looked up any information on it, but I think there's a lot going on with the rats and with the kind of layout and the kind of social structure of the farm, and these rats who came from being genetically tested, and how NIMH actually stands for the National Institute of Mental Health or Hygiene, I forget which you would probably wouldn't expect, but yes, that's the secrets of NIMH, is like that they were experimented on and that they have become super intelligent and be able to thrive, and that the National Institute of, let's say, Mental Hygiene sort of knows about it somehow and is going to like exterminate them because they don't like want intelligent rats being around and stuff. They saw Planet of the Apes, so they know. All of this stuff is going on between like this whole like fight between the rats on they continue to steal power, have their own power, and they shouldn't keep stealing as they're understanding morality and other complex ideas. There's all sorts of interesting ideas that you can really get into. Doug Walker, believe it or not, actually made a pretty good theory video about this, which is surprising. Apparently Secret of NIMH is one of his favorite movies, and I actually thought he did a good job on that video. But it does really get into all of the various issues of new technology and understanding the morals of new technology, and you're so off the reservation in terms of talking about Mrs. Brisby, who is what this film is about. That's what this film is about. It's about a mom trying to care for her sick kid and her family family and make sure they're okay. That's a really smart way that Don Bluth structured this whole film, which opens in such a weird way. Like, it doesn't open like most animated films open with like, look at this animation, look at this crazy sequence, aren't you excited? And instead it's like, we're gonna open a book and Mrs. Brisby's like kind of going through this thing to talk to this other guy. It's not a huge opening, really. You know, it gets big in other points in the film, but it like slowly opens. Now this is like kind of more of a 70s film than an 80s film, clearly, because it was in production for 30 months, and judging by my bad math, that sounds like this started in 1979, but 1980 was sort of more of the 70s and the 70s filmmaking traditions. Even though animation had, you know, Fritz the Cat and Ralph Bakshi and had certain things in the 70s, Disney and family animation really kind of sat out that decade culturally. I mean, you know, when you think of 70s film, you might think of Ralph Bakshi, you might think of heavy metal or, you know, something, stuff like that, but you're not going to think of much else. And this to me feels more like a late 70s, early 80s film. It's not as Spielberg influenced as his later works would be. Obviously they're produced by Spielberg, the next two. This almost feels like a completely different form of Don Bluth, which I sort of really like about the opening. I was a little like disarmed by it, because I was like, I thought you're supposed to like wow me with this world and all the world building you're doing, but it's just like sort of doing it obviously through Mrs. Brisby. I think she's kind of good in that it centers the film, because the film is very much about her and her journey and her family, and that's an easy thing to follow, but it also makes it so they're like, okay, we have to explain this to you. Yeah, your husband, who clearly like you did not know very well, did all this stuff. By the way, did you guys just like fuck and he left? Because that's what it seems like. But whatever. You don't know very much of any specifics, and they'll sort of get into it, and there's other details that if you really think about it, you're like, wait, what's this and that? And you're like, but that's not really important to the task at hand, which is her helping her family. And under the task at hand, which is the plot of this film, it works perfectly. I thought it was very smartly structured, because you have to understand what you're really saying in your story, not get obsessed with world building, which you can totally do with this film. When I was hearing even in Doug Walker's video or other people's stuff talk about the world of this, I was like, oh my god, yeah, that is actually really interesting. But I was so into what's happening to Mrs. Brisby, I like sort of didn't, I mean, I cared, but I wasn't as obsessed with it. And I can kind of understand people who've seen this multiple times. I had seen this when I was a little kid, which Ebert kind of said he doesn't think the complexity of this film works for little kids. And I think because of the complexity of understanding animation in 1982 was not great on a critical level. But I sort of agree with that, because I would not show this film to my daughter. I would show her like Land Before Time or American Tail or All Dogs Go to Heaven or something. I think this is more for your, like, you know, you're in grade school, mid-grade school or something. But I did see this as a little kid, and I remembered bits of it and frames of it, but none of the emotion and story or anything is really going to hit you at that time. I sort of do agree with it, but it's more of the complexity of the story and less because animation is for kids. I think this is probably a film that would be good to, if you want your kid to continue to like animation through just being, you know, a little kid, this would be a good film to show them, because it shows them more complexity. It actually sort of reminds me, believe it or not, of Akira in terms of the story, in terms of how it deals with all its world building and all the chaos of it, because in Akira it's almost more about the kind of experience of it than it is like telling a completely cohesive story. I think there's a lot going on in Akira. In Secret of NIMH, there isn't too much. I think you can follow it, but you don't really get into everything, and I think it understands that. And much like Akira understands how part of being an experience of a movie is what makes that narrative work, I think that works for Secret of NIMH as well. Secret of NIMH ties it together maybe better in a way than Akira. I don't think this movie's better than Akira, I don't think I said that. But I think in terms of structurally like making this like a more digestible film, Akira's weirder and more, Akira's better, just leave me alone. But Secret of NIMH, I think, is able to kind of navigate that in an interesting way and kind of show you like, hey, there's a lot of other stuff going on in the world regardless of what you need to do with your family, which is definitely something I relate to. And I think Secret of NIMH really did well. A lot of the tricks Don Bluth did, and particularly like what he did with lighting, which is something we think of more now in CG animation, is getting some beautiful lighting. He really did a lot of cool stuff with backlit animation, which I think makes it look, the animation look more glowing, and the lighting look very beautiful in this. I mean, if you compare this to something like Fox and the Hound on an animation perspective, it's in a different league of its own. A lot of what was really being covered was more of simplistic and slimmed down, and this felt like a bigger world and a lot of complex ideas that he didn't really skirt away from, which is, I think, the interesting thing about Secret of NIMH, is it feels a lot more mature, but it also feels a lot more complex. I think the narrative's like, we can't get into that, but we are acknowledging that there's like a lot of other stuff going on. And this also felt like, the interesting thing about Don Bluth that no one really gets into is that he does a lot of theater productions. I know that's not what we think of him, and that's not when he dies what he will be remembered for, but he has a theater, he does a lot of stuff with that. And this reminds me more Hollywood in the theater tradition, because there's a lot of scenes of just people talking to one another, more so than I can think of any of his other things. That's probably why his character and his acting is so strong, because he has that tradition and he does work in that. This was a book that was being considered by Disney in 1972. They decided to turn it down. Other animators were interested in it and told Don Bluth about it when he was doing the animation for Pete's Dragon. I think it is kind of a bold stance to basically take a thing that Disney was like, no, it's too dark, and they're like, well, we'll do it and we'll do it great. But I think that shows kind of the fault in Disney and what they would later do with something like The Black Cauldron, which tried to appeal to teens and obviously failed. This film wasn't a huge success. It made its money back and was sort of okay, but due to an animation strike and not making a ton of money also, this version of Don Bluth's company, I think it was called Don Bluth. This was Don Bluth Productions. Okay, sorry. This one was Don Bluth Productions, but then he became like the Bluth Group and all these different like Don Bluth Limited kind of company names. There's like way too many to talk about, but the first version of that made Xanadu and Banjo the Woodpile Cat folded at this point and then reorganized and became what made Dragon's Lair and Space Ace, and then that fell apart. Like, Don Bluth has companies and then they fall apart. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work out for him. Kind of bad luck on that part. I wish this film had done better. It wasn't released in the best way, and it had to compete with like the behemoth that was E.T. that just took over the summer of 1982, and Poltergeist and Wrath of Khan, and 82 was a crazy summer. I think this film just unfortunately got swallowed up. Also, it wasn't released in the best way, and I think that was probably a bigger factor than just E.T. It's just things didn't just open wide back then. They would open in different territories and different regions, and this film definitely did that. And I think when promotion was at its height, it didn't open in other areas, and so that didn't make the money it needed to, but it did open pretty wide for an animated film that wasn't a Disney film, which didn't happen a lot then, especially for a film like this. But The Secret of NIMH is a powerful film that shows what animation can really do and tell a story that, I think in a lot of ways, one of the greatest things that Don Bluth did with his animated features is he would animate things that couldn't be done in any other medium, especially at the time. I guess you could do this now because of the mouse guard test footage or whatever, but I think if you look at The Secret of NIMH in 1982, guess what? This is the only way you were doing it, and specifically in a post-Watership Down world, if I'm getting my dates right, it made sense to make a film like this. This is the only way you could make a film like Secret of NIMH, and he definitely took on a narrative in a different way. This doesn't feel like the typical kind of family-friendly movie, and it highlights the kind of Don Bluth as an interesting new voice, probably more than any of his other films. I know he slowly came around to this film, having to work so hard on it, not being the huge success he wanted it to be, but it kind of announces a new animation voice at a time where you wouldn't really get a lot of those. This film really did that. I really liked rewatching, I guess watching it because it's been a long time since I was like a little kid when I saw this. I saw this a couple of times at friends' houses and things like that. Secret of NIMH, I think, shows maybe Don Bluth's most complex film, although I love a lot of his other films, but I was sort of taken aback by this film. It really felt like his kind of opus, a film that takes on such an interesting, complex narrative, and a film that you can watch multiple times, because it made me want to think about the rats and think about the idea that we experimented on these things and made them hyper intelligent and gave them morals and things, and then wanted to eradicate them. And that's just a small subplot that we barely get into. The fact that they thought about the idea of stealing power rather than finding a new way that was morally just, and that they were having basically a philosophical argument about such a thing. But at the same time, this is a film about what most narrative Hollywood films are about, like a simple narrative through line type of a thing to get you through, to get you in, to be able to bounce off these philosophical things, but to have like kind of a moral center to it. And that's Mrs. Brisby, who was a really great character, because at first you think she's just kind of like this wet rag or something, but you kind of realize how strong and how amazing she is. She's basically a single mom in this crazy complex crazy farm world, and she's trying to find a way to save her son who has pneumonia, and kind of can't really entirely, even though she is appreciative of everything and interested in everything that's going on, particularly the backstory with her husband. It's really, I think, a smart narrative because it kind of acknowledges it while also finding a way to get through it as well, and I thought that was kind of genius in what it did in terms of writing the screenplay. I thought they did a really good job on this film. Even Jerry Goldsmith's score, which is great, which he really loves, a Paul Williams song. This is a really I think one of Don Bluth's greatest films, if not his greatest, although I am partial to Land Before Time. But I think this kind of stands away from all those because those are far more all audience kind of movies, and I think this film's a little more interesting, a little more complex than trying to do that, and he does it so well, and kind of knew his gifts from Disney from storytelling and didn't water it down, but also made it presentable and digestible, which is a pretty amazing thing, and not a lot of directors can do that as flawlessly and as perfectly as Don Bluth did with The Secret of NIMH. So if you have seen The Secret of NIMH and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And this was a winner of my Patreon movie review vote. If you would like for me to review a movie of your choice, then click on the link below and pledge, and maybe I'll be reviewing your movie next month. Thank you very much for watching.